Sometimes all it takes is one wrong turn for the global economy to become paralyzed. On March 23rd, 2021, the container ship Ever Given, as long as 4 football fields, ran aground in the Suez Canal. It seemed like a routine accident, but within days, the world realized that a third of global trade depends on a single, narrow strip of water in the Egyptian desert. Hundreds of ships were stuck in line. Losses were calculated in the billions of dollars every single day. Deliveries of everything from coffee and toilet paper to components for Tesla came to a halt. And it was then that it became clear the global economy hangs by a thread. Now imagine this. If one stuck ship can paralyze world trade, what's happening with those who control the planet's key choke points? Ports, canals, processing plants, even water rights. All of it has long been bought up and divided. And while we were arguing about who owns the oil and gas, someone else was quietly seizing something far more important: civilization's bottlenecks. Today, we're going to show you what the economic reports don't talk about. How a handful of companies quietly seized control over the planet's resources. Why the price of your breakfast might depend on the water level in a canal thousands of miles away. And most importantly, how a single decision in China could leave half the world without phones. Ready to find out who really runs the world? Spoiler alert, it's not who you think. And now, onto our topic. To understand who controls the world's resources today, we need to look back to the 19th century, and you'll soon see why. The resource market was never just a competition where the first to find ore or drill a well wins. As early as the 19th century, rules emerged that changed the very nature of trade. In 1877, the London Metal Exchange, the LME, opened its doors. At first, it was an almost intimate gathering of copper and tin traders. But gradually, it established standards for quality, delivery dates, and metal categories. The exchange did something revolutionary. It turned ore into a financial contract. Now, metal could be bought and sold even if it hadn't been mined yet. By the early 20th century, the LME was setting the price benchmarks for half of the world's copper market. A few decades later, John D. Rockefeller demonstrated what true control looked like. His company, Standard Oil, didn't just pump oil. It held the pipelines, the refineries, and the transportation in its grip. By 1911, the company controlled 90% of American oil. It dictated prices and terms, and this was no longer a game on an exchange. It was a real monopoly. When the U.S. Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil into 34 separate companies, it sent a signal for the future. A direct monopoly can be broken, but power exerted through infrastructure and logistics is far more resilient and subtle. Now let's jump to 1991. The Soviet Union is collapsing, and a vast industrial system is thrown into chaos. A country that produced 20% of the world's aluminum and was the second largest nickel producer suddenly opens up to Western traders. For them, it was an opportunity not seen since the days of Rockefeller. While the major players were carving up the oil and gas sector, lesser-known companies filled the niche of metals export. One of them was the Swiss company Glencore. In the early 90s, it was just a middleman with fantastic margins. But they understood the key principle. Why depend on suppliers when you can become the supplier yourself? By 2013, Glencore had acquired Xstrata and become one of the largest players in mining, holding stakes in the export of copper, zinc, and cobalt. From mines in the Congo to factories in Europe, the entire chain was in one company's hands. And then there's China. After the American Mountain Pass mine closed in 1991, China adopted its technologies and concentrated rare earth processing in Baotou, Inner Mongolia. The Americans thought, so what? It's just ore. But they missed the main point. Rare earth metals are the lifeblood of all modern electronics. No neodymium, no speakers in your headphones, no europium, no red light in your monitors, no dysprosium, no wind turbines. By 2010, China's share of the global market had reached 95%. And then it restricted exports to Japan over a territorial dispute in the East China Sea. The price of neodymium skyrocketed from $40 to $330 per kilogram in just 3 months. Europium's price quintupled. The whole world understood. Whoever holds the rare earths holds the future. This is how the new rules of the game were formed. It doesn't matter how many deposits or fields you have. What matters is whether you control the bottleneck through which the resource reaches the consumer. Power belongs not to those who dig, but to those who control the flow. And this very principle will be key in the new era. When lithium, nickel, cobalt, and copper, the materials of the energy transition and the digital economy, take center stage, they will become a map of power, just as oil and grain once were. And the fight for them will be far fiercer than all the resource wars of the past. Take lithium. It's increasingly called the new oil of the 21st century, and for good reason. Every battery in a Tesla Model S, for instance, contains about 62 kilograms of lithium. Even your iPhone has 1 gram. It seems like there should be enough to go around. Proven global lithium reserves are estimated at around 30 million tons, with total resources exceeding 100 million. But in reality, the issue isn't the reserves, but the bottlenecks in the supply chain. Today, almost half of all lithium is mined in Australia, another quarter in Chile, and about 20% in China. But the real point of control is processing. 6 out of every 10 batteries in the world, from phones to electric cars, depend on Chinese factories. That's where the majority of lithium chemicals, without which a battery simply won't work, are produced. Australian concentrate is loaded onto tankers and shipped to Chinese ports, where it's turned into lithium carbonate and hydroxide. the substances needed for batteries. Without this stage, lithium is just ore. That's why automakers are making proactive moves. In 2020, Tesla signed a 5-year offtake agreement with the American company Piedmont Lithium, effectively prepaying for supplies that didn't even exist yet just to secure the resource. It's a classic story. Without a contract, the mine gets no funding, and without the mine, the company gets no raw material. And if lithium is a long-term game, cobalt has become a major headache right here and now. Most of it is mined in the Congo, from industrial mines to artisanal ones. But the crucial link, once again, isn't in Africa. Over 2/3 of cobalt processing is concentrated in China. African hydroxide is shipped thousands of miles to be turned into cobalt sulfate, a key battery component in Chinese factory. This creates a paradox. Africa digs, China controls. In 2021, when demand for batteries surged, the price of cobalt jumped by 80% in just a few months. And this is despite the fact that there's plenty of the metal in the ground. The shortage is created precisely by the processing bottleneck. Automakers are frantically searching for a way out. Glencore is signing direct contracts with Tesla and others. But this doesn't solve the problem, it just redistributes the scarcity. The next element is copper. It's often called the blood of electrification. For example, every electric vehicle requires nearly 100 kilograms of copper, 4 times more than a conventional car with an internal combustion engine. Wires, motors, charging stations, it's all made of copper. The International Energy Agency predicts that demand for it will double by 2040. But the main suppliers of this copper, Chile and Peru, also depend on bottlenecks. In 2023, due to a severe drought, the Panama Canal operated at 1/3 of its capacity. Hundreds of ships were stuck in line, freight costs soared, and copper concentrate from South America simply couldn't reach Asia. The price of copper immediately went up. A single waterway was able to sway the global market. And finally, nickel, the most dramatic case in recent years. In March 2022, the price of nickel on the London Metal Exchange skyrocketed by 100% in a single day, hitting an all-time high of $100,000 per ton. For the first time in decades, the exchange had to halt trading and even cancel deals. The reason? One of the largest Chinese traders had taken a massive short position, a bet that prices would fall. But then rumors of sanctions against Norilsk Nickel, a key global producer, began to circulate. The price shot up and the trader received a margin call, a demand to deposit an additional $15 billion. The money wasn't there, the market exploded, and the exchange froze trading. It was the first time that the physical risk of a metal shortage had crashed a financial market. This is what the new reality looks like. The metals of the future, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, are even more concentrated than oil or grain. Mining is centered in a few countries, but processing is in just 1 or 2. And any disruption, be it a drought in Panama or a political decision in Beijing, reverberates across the entire planet. But metals are only part of the picture. There's a resource that seems infinite until it starts to disappear, and when it does, everything stops. In December 2020, for the first time in history, Chicago began trading water futures. The Nasdaq Vilas California Water Index represents the price for the right to 1 acre-foot of water in California. That's about 1.2 million liters, enough to cover a football field with 30 centimeters of water. Sounds strange? But that's how people in the 19th century viewed trading contracts for wheat that hadn't even been harvested yet. Today, these water rights in California cost about $1,200 per acre-foot. For comparison, in the 1990s, it was a few $100s. In the early 2010s, less than $1,000. And in drought years, the price can easily jump to $2,500 because water is only free at first glance. In reality, 9 countries control 60% of the planet's entire freshwater runoff. Brazil, Russia, the United States, Canada, China, Indonesia, India, Colombia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But just like with oil or metals, the question isn't who has the resource, but who controls the tap. Take Saudi Arabia. The country has almost no natural freshwater, yet it holds 20% of the world's desalination capacity. The world's largest plant in Ras Al Khair produces 1 million cubic meters of water daily, enough for 4 million people. The technology belongs to France's Veolia and Israel's IDE Technologies. The Saudis buy the water, but its distribution is entirely under their control. In California, this is especially noticeable. We've already mentioned that water is traded here like a financial asset. But in daily life, it all comes down to a much more mundane dependency. The flow is distributed by the Hoover Dam. The decisions of its operators determine how much water goes to Los Angeles, Las Vegas, or agriculture. 20 million people effectively depend on a small number of engineers and administrators who manage the floodgates, and that's far from the only barrier. Experts estimate that 30% to 40% of water is lost in supply systems due to leaks, old pipes, and theft. In some cities, losses reach 60%. Recovering this water is equivalent to building a new source. That's why controlling these losses is becoming as vital a resource as a river or reservoir. The largest private operators, Veolia, Suez, Thames Water, manage networks in dozens of countries, and they decide whether to invest in repairs what tariffs to set, and whose water to shut off for non-payment. If the situation with water looks alarming, the food situation is even more stark. The Big Four, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, control not only the global grain trade, but the entire logistics chain: elevators, river terminals, railway cars, and seaports. Without them, not a single grain of wheat would get from the American prairies to Asian tables. Let's look at the journey of American wheat to Asia. Grain from Kansas is transported by barge down the Mississippi River to the ports of New Orleans. This corridor handles 60% of all U.S. soybean and corn exports. But in 2022, a drought caused the Mississippi to drop to record low levels. Barges had to be loaded to half capacity, convoys were shortened, and shipping costs doubled. In one quarter, corn exports fell by 20%. A single riverway swayed global food prices. Now imagine you're a farmer in Kansas. Your harvest is ready, but it will only reach a buyer in Asia if all the links in the chain align. The rivers don't run dry. The elevators are working. The railway isn't stopped. The ports accept the cargo. The ships set sail, and the insurance covers the route. At every stage, there is a gatekeeper, and any one of them can turn off the tap. Now let's go back to March 23rd, 2021 at 7:40 a.m. The container ship Ever Given, 400 meters long, runs aground in the Suez Canal. One bad maneuver and the planet's main trade artery is blocked. During the 6-day blockage, nearly 370 ships piled up in the queue. The cost of world trade was $9.6 billion per day. The Suez Canal carries 12% of all global trade and a third of all containers between Asia and Europe. And just one ship stopped all deliveries, from toilet paper to Tesla components. The Suez Canal is a 193-kilometer passage between the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Without it, the journey from Asia to Europe is 8,000 kilometers longer, adding 10 days of sailing around Africa. In 1967, the canal was closed for 8 years due to war. This forced the urgent construction of supertankers, as regular ships couldn't profitably transport oil on such a long route. Today, 5% of the world's oil, 8% of its liquefied natural gas, and a quarter of all Asia-Europe containers pass through the Suez. Egypt earns about $9 billion a year from the canal, simply for controlling a strip of water. But the Suez isn't the only bottleneck. The Strait of Hormuz is just a few dozen kilometers of water between Iran and Oman. But through this narrow passage flows about a fifth of all the world's oil and nearly a quarter of its liquefied gas every single day. The shipping lane here is so narrow that tankers pass literally one after another. Any disruption and the flow of fuel stops. All exports from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates go through this strait. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close Hormuz in response to sanctions. In 2019, tankers were seized and passages were mined here. Lloyd's of London declared the Gulf a high-risk zone. Insurance premiums rose from 0.005% to 0.1% of a vessel's value per transit. For a $100 million tanker, that's an extra $100,000 for a single trip. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow passage, just a couple of kilometers wide between Malaysia and Indonesia. Up to 90,000 ships and millions of barrels of oil pass through it every day each year. Bypassing it via the Lombok or Sunda Straits adds several days to the journey. In the 2000s, Malacca was an epicenter of piracy until joint patrols by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore brought it under control. And now another factor is added to geography: climate. The Panama Canal, for example, depends on fresh water from Gatun Lake. Each lock uses about 200 million liters, and this water flows into the ocean, never to return. In dry years, there isn't enough supply. In 2023, the lake's level dropped to a record low. The canal restricted passage to 32 ships per day, instead of the usual 38. Over 200 ships were waiting in line, and freight rates shot up by 300%. Copper concentrate from Chile, grain from the United States, liquefied gas from America to Europe. Everything got stuck due to a lack of rain in a tropical forest. And then there's the Rhine River in Germany. Not a canal, but a river. But for Europe, it's no less critical. 230 million tons of cargo per year. Coal, petroleum products, chemicals, grain. In 2022, the water level near the town of Kaub dropped to 32 centimeters. Barges were loaded to a quarter of their capacity, and the chemical giant BASF had to cut production because raw materials simply couldn't get through. Freight rates increased fivefold. The paradox is that the more efficient global logistics become, the more vulnerable they are to disruptions. Saving money on backup routes results in a dependency on weather and bottlenecks. Amid these risks, the role of regional insurers and operators is growing. A market once dominated by a few global companies is beginning to fragment. Logistics is becoming more and more fragmented, and thus more vulnerable. But behind all these physical flows lies another layer of control, the financial one. This is where prices are formed, even for tons of cargo that may not exist in nature. Physical resources can be touched, counted in tons or barrels. But on the exchanges, traders have long been dealing in things that may not exist in reality. On the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the volume of so-called paper barrels of oil traded each day is 30 times greater than the world's actual production. Copper futures exceed annual production several times over. It turns out that the price of real resources is determined by people who have never even seen those resources. And then the subtle game with infrastructure begins. The London Metal Exchange maintains a list of accredited warehouses. Only metal from these warehouses can be used for delivery against futures contracts. In the 2010s, these warehouses were bought up by financial giants. Goldman Sachs owned aluminum storage facilities in Detroit. The scheme worked like this: the company would buy metal, move it to its warehouse, and when clients requested shipment, it would put them in a queue. According to exchange rules, they had to release at least 1,500 tons per day. Goldman released exactly that amount, but at the same time, it shuffled aluminum from one of its warehouses to another. The queue stretched for months. An artificial shortage was created in Detroit, and the premium over the exchange price grew from $50 to $500 per ton. Automakers paid several times more, even though the metal was physically sitting right next door. In 2013, a scandal erupted. The exchange increased its loadout rates, and Goldman sold the warehouses. But the example remained. Exchange warehouses had become a tool for manipulation. A similar system works for gold. The London Bullion Market Association maintains a good delivery list. Only refineries on this list can sell metal to the largest banks. Being removed from the list means an automatic discount. As industry media noted, in 2022, a Moscow refinery was removed from the list, and Russian gold immediately began trading at a discount on the world market. The physical bar of gold was the same, but a piece of paper changed its price. And that's not the limit. In 2012, one of the biggest financial scandals was exposed: the manipulation of the LIBOR rate, the London Interbank Offered Rate. Every day, banks would report the interest rate at which they were willing to lend to each other. This data was compiled into a single figure, and it was this figure that became the benchmark for trillions of dollars in contracts, from mortgages and loans to deals in oil, gas, and metals. But it turned out that the banks were playing for their own benefit. Barclays, UBS, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, and others had been tweaking the rates for years, sometimes to hide their own problems during a crisis, sometimes so their traders could profit from price movements. All it took was an email or a call along the lines of, "Just nudge the number a bit lower, we need it." As a result, millions of people around the world paid different interest rates on their loans, and the cost of resources changed because of an agreement between a few traders in London. Investigations in the US, UK, and Japan uncovered dozens of episodes. The banks had to pay billions of dollars in fines, and several traders went to prison. But most importantly, trust was shattered. LIBOR, the foundation of the entire global financial system, turned out to be manipulable. In 2021, it began to be phased out and replaced with new indexes. And here it becomes clear. The deciding factor can be not just the resource itself, but the framework within which it exists. Sometimes that framework is expressed in numbers on an exchange, and sometimes in the dry lines of technical document. Sometimes control over an entire industry comes down to a single technical standard: the width of a railway track, the type of a connector, or the permissible concentration of impurities. Sounds boring? In reality, it's these little things that create barriers higher than any mountain of ore. Take railways. There are dozens of different track gauge standards around the world. In Russia and the CIS countries, the gauge is 1,520 millimeters. In Europe and China, it's 1,435. In India, 1,676. A difference of a few centimeters means that a Russian train carrying coal physically cannot run on European tracks. At the border, you need transshipment terminals or a change of bogies. This means days of downtime and thousands of dollars in costs for every railcar. In the Soviet Union, this standard was chosen deliberately as a barrier against invasion. Today, it isolates post-Soviet logistics from Europe. A single technical choice made a century ago still shapes trade flows. Now imagine you can control such standards. In 2020, China banned the export of rare earth processing technologies, not the metals themselves, but the technologies for their separation and purification. China had once bought these processes from the Americans and has now turned them into a state secret. Companies that want to process rare earths outside of China must either reinvent everything from scratch or buy Chinese equipment on Chinese terms. It's an elegant trap. You can mine the ore anywhere, but you can only turn it into the needed product where the technology exists. The same logic applies to patents. The Haber-Bosch process for producing ammonia is the foundation of all nitrogen fertilizers. It was invented in Germany over 100 years ago, and today, the licenses belong to a few chemical giants. If you want to produce fertilizer, you pay for the technology. There are almost no other options. Chemistry doesn't offer many workarounds. In water desalination, there's its own club of companies with key patents. In catalysts for oil refining, there are their own gatekeepers. Whoever controls the technology controls the industry. But there are even more subtle barriers: industrial standards. For example, an international environmental certificate. It's formally voluntary, but major corporations require it from all their suppliers. No certificate, no contract. Getting one costs tens of thousands of dollars and takes years. For a small business, this is effectively a barrier to entry. In aviation and aerospace, the filter is even tighter. ASTM standards for aluminum include dozens of parameters: strength, chemical composition, corrosion resistance. Only a plant with multi-million-dollar equipment and a staff of engineers can pass such a certification. The rest are left to the commercial market where prices are lower. And today, environmental and social filters have been added to the technical ones. Green aluminum versus dirty aluminum. Formally, the metal is the same, 99.7% pure, but if it's produced using hydroelectric power, its price can be 20% higher. Automakers are willing to overpay for their ESG ratings. Who decides what counts as green? Organizations like the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. The biggest companies are on its board. If you're included, your metal sells at a premium. If not, you have to trade at a discount. The story with cobalt is even more interesting. Up to 15% of the total volume is mined artisanally in the Congo, often using child labor. Battery manufacturers are massively refusing to use such raw materials. The result is an artificial shortage. There's a lot of cobalt in the ground, but very little clean cobalt. Two parallel markets emerge: certified metal with a high price and a gray market that's 30 to 50% cheaper. And this is just the beginning. In the coming years, the European Union will introduce carbon tariffs, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. Aluminum or steel produced with high carbon emissions will be subject to an additional tax. Formally, it's about ecology. In reality, it's a trade weapon. This is how a multi-level ladder of filters is built. First, you have to mine the ore. Then, you need the technology to process it. After that, you must pass certification. Then, you have to meet environmental requirements. And at every level, there are gatekeepers who decide who gets to pass. As a result, simple mining turns into a full-blown obstacle course. And it is the combination of these barriers that forms the new map of control over resources. All these stories fit together into a single system. In the 21st century, what matters isn't how much of a resource is in the ground, but who controls the path from the mine or field to the end consumer. Coal, grain, lithium, oil, it all comes down to bottlenecks where power is concentrated in the hands of a few players. We've already seen the examples. China has taken control not only of rare earths, but also the technology to process them. Glencore has consolidated mining, trading, and logistics under one roof. And the drought in the Panama Canal showed that a single waterway can sway global prices for copper and grain. Control has become multi-layered, and every layer is critical. What's next? It's impossible to say for sure, but many signs point to climate disruptions more frequently disabling canals and rivers. New environmental standards and carbon tariffs could turn raw materials into instruments of trade wars. The scarcity of lithium and cobalt will likely make technology a strategic resource, and access to certifications a ticket to the market. Supply chains may become shorter, but also more expensive, and global trade even more vulnerable. Governments are already including resources in their national security lists, on par with the military. For companies, this likely means living with constant uncertainty. You need a backup plan for every route, insurance for every shipment, and diversification at every step. And for the average person, this system manifests itself very simply on the price tag. A drought in Argentina raises the price of bread. Problems with tankers in the Persian Gulf are reflected in the cost of gasoline. Even your smartphone gets more expensive, not just because of exchange rates, but due to disruptions in lithium or cobalt supplies. And it's important to understand this. Even if a country has its own fields or deposits, it still feels the effects of the overall increase. World prices move in sync. If it gets more expensive in one region, prices rise in all the others. And therefore, the main conclusion is this. In the 21st century, the real resource is access. Access to ports, to technologies, to standards, to financial markets. And as long as a few major players control the key points, everyone else remains vulnerable. So that was a pretty fascinating topic for today, folks. What do you think is the most vulnerable point in the global economy today? Let me know in the comments. It'll be interesting to discuss. Support us with a like and a subscription. It helps us create more great and insightful breakdowns. See you next time. Bye-bye.